The name of this trash can is ideology.
Today I want to talk to you about the Laffer Curve. If you haven't heard of it before, this is something that is very instrumental in U.S. economic policy since the 1980s. So definitely something you might want to learn some more about. Essentially, it's a tax theory that was proposed by Arthur Laffer, who was on Reagan's Economic Advisory Board and was instrumental in the 1980 Reagan tax cuts. And on a note, Arthur Laffer is not the person that actually came up with this. He's just the namesake of it. However, this idea has been around for a long time. The credit that Laffer himself gives is to an Arabic historian and philosopher named Ibn Khaldun. In simplest terms, what the Laffer curve is its relationship between taxation rates and government tax revenue. And it's used often to support the idea that cutting taxes could actually lead to increasing tax revenue. This is something that seems very counterintuitive when you hear it, but let's look at the graph itself. So when we're looking at the Laffer curve, what we want to look at, and this is a very simple idea, is that at 0% tax rate, so here we're looking at tax rates and here we're looking at tax revenues. At 0% tax rates, you would have no revenue, but zero taxes. Pretty simple. However, you might have more productivity at this point. You know, you could have a high amount of productivity, but no revenue that's being brought in by the government. However, at 100% tax rate, the maximum that you could, there's no incentive, right, to work more because all that money's being taxed away. Why would I work harder to have money taken away from me? With both of these scenarios, a minimum tax rate and a maximum tax rate, both of them lead to zero revenue. This is the basic principle behind the Laffer curve. And it assumes that all the points in between 100% and 0% are going to produce positive revenue, and that's your curve. This is based on Rolle's theorem from calculus, and it posits that there is an optimal tax rate along this curve, optimal being where it maximizes tax revenue. So up here at the highest point in the curve, when tax rates are above the optimal rate, then what this means is that taxes are too high and that we should then cut taxes because it will actually increase revenue. Therefore, if we raise taxes above the optimal rate, revenue is decreased. And further, where growth is steepest is the growth maximizing point. So when we're looking here, we see the steepest portion of the curve. This is where, you're going to see more growth is the general argument. And then up as taxes increase, you see growth start to slow down, hence why revenue starts to slow down. And this is where we have the ideology behind let's lower taxes to increase growth in the private sector. And so Laffer used this idea. Famously, he wrote it on a napkin, and the napkin is actually in the Smithsonian. And he did it as a way to argue against raising taxes. He was pushing for tax cuts during the 1980s in the US. And this is what is at the core of what we call colloquially Reaganomics. And so this makes intuitive sense. The more of my pay that I get to keep, the less discouraged I'll be to work harder to earn more. But it's not all rainbows and sunshine. So let's go over the problems of the Laffer curve. So there are 5 big problems with the assumptions that the Laffer curve makes. And so let's go over those. Number 1, we don't have a clue what the shape of the curve in the real world application is going to be. We don't know that it's going to be a perfectly parabolic equation, and therefore, when we're trying to understand what the optimal tax rate is, how are we supposed to do that when making policy, right? Because we can't just assume that the world is as simplistic as we want it to be for simplicity's sake. We have to have a representative model. And so this is why advocates often argue for lowering taxes regardless since the 1980s, because it functionally is just a way to justify the ideology of lowering taxes being good. And this is something that conveniently benefits people that are already fairly wealthy. And that's kind of the problem behind it and where this whole idea starts to fall apart, because while it starts off by appearing as very simplistic and something that makes sense and is true and intuitive and something that is unbiased, the reality is that it has an ideology behind it. And that's something we need to understand, because all economic decisions have ideology behind them. So number 2, there's no reason that there should only be one maximal point. We, again, don't know that this is the shape of a parabola. This could be many different shapes. There could be multiple maximal points, and it could be skewed left or right, meaning that the point is not somewhere in the middle, and therefore we don't know which direction to go, right? The optimal tax rate for maximum revenue could be at 90%. It could be at 50%. The only way we know is by testing that. We can't just assume that we know what the shape is. That's something that's very convenient because it sounds objective, but it's really not. And then number 3, even if we know what the shape is, the shape probably isn't static. It's probably not the same shape all the time because it's going to shift as incentive structures within the society shift, as tax rates shift. The shape is going to be changing on a consistent basis. So that would require, if we wanted to truly maximize the tax revenue, then we would be constantly adjusting this, which is not something that's really possible when it comes to policy positions. But then also the changes, we don't know whether or not when those changes do occur, right? Let's say we do cut taxes. Well, when we cut taxes and let's say growth does go up, we don't know if those changes are because it's actually following the Laffer curve as we assume, or we don't know if the entire curve has shifted, which would then make a new maximum. So again, it's too simplistic. It doesn't take into account enough variables to be able to adequately inform us in the real world. And then number 4 is this assumption that tax policy's only goal is to maximize revenue is very silly. We don't have taxes as a way to maximize government revenue. Yes, we want to have a specific amount of revenue in order to have good stuff, right, that we can pay for. However, the issue is that we have other social goals. Maybe it's redistributive efforts. Maybe it's for credits for stuff that people like. Maybe it's to pay for healthcare. Maybe it's to pay for the military. Maybe it's to pay for police, schools. We don't necessarily want to maximize revenue. We could maximize revenue by taxing everyone, but at the same time, is it necessary and is it something that's socially good to tax people that barely make enough to live? Shouldn't we let those people possibly keep more of theirs and maybe even not pay taxes up to a certain point like we do in the United States until they're making enough money where they are able to comfortably pay for their basic, life necessities? So it kind of doesn't understand the way taxes work. Generally speaking, rather than to maximize revenue, the goal when it comes to tax policy is just say, hey, how much do the things that we as a society agree we want cost? And then how do we minimize those costs? We're not trying to catch up to the number revenue. Instead, we're trying to figure out what is the minimum that we're able to tax everyone and still pay for all the things people want. It's not the same goal. And then 5, it assumes that cutting taxes can grow the economy. And the problem with this is while on this curve, yeah, okay, with those very, very generous assumptions that you're making, okay, it looks like that's true. But the reality is there is no evidence of this in the real world. For more info, definitely look at policy inspired by this. Check out the Kansas experiment under Governor Sam Brownback from 2012 to 2017. Got a really good article study in the description about that. I'll be doing a video on it as well, but needless to say, Sam Brownback had direct influence from Arthur Laffer when he wanted to cut taxes to grow Kansas' economy, and it was a abject failure. This isn't something that has been shown to work in the real world. There's no empirical evidence, and this is why we should just be laughing at it. It's not something that needs to be taken seriously, and whenever we hear politicians or policymakers make this old, tired argument that has led to greater economic inequality since the 1980s, we should really be skeptical of it, and we should understand the ideology behind what they're talking about, because this isn't something that is new. This isn't something that they came up with recently. It's been around, and it's something that we shouldn't really be taking seriously on a policy standpoint. And so anyway, if you guys have questions and you want me to cover other basic economic stuff, let me know in the description. Appreciate you watching, and be on the lookout for that video on Sam Brownback as well. I'll do that as soon as I can. Thank you guys. Peace.